I think we are at capacity. So rather than verbal, I'm going to firstly welcome everybody on behalf of Radix Big Tent. Radix Big Tent, for those who don't know us, is the system change think tank. We have that horribly messy name because we're the result of the merger of two previous think tanks, Radix and Big Tent, both of which sought to provide a platform for the those outside the Westminster bubble to be able to engage in political debate. In that context, whilst I think this is probably our most Westminster heavy panel that we've had for a very long time. But we always try to make certain that everybody gets a chance to join in the discussion. Those who've submitted in questions in advance, we will certainly come to them. And by all means, do bung something in the chat if thoughts occur to you, and Vicky will be pulling those in. I'm going to hand over to Vicky Pryce, who is the new chair of Radix, as well as our chair of fellows, as well as being one of the country's leading economists. I try occasionally to turn on the Today programme without hearing her, but it's few and far between that those days happen. Vicky, over to you.
Extremely kind of you. Thank you, Ben. And thank you all for joining. And indeed, quite a lot of familiar faces, but also quite a lot of others. And of course, in many cases, I can't see the faces because they're all blacked out for the moment. But we will encourage you all to become involved later. It is a session which is, I think, is going to be incredibly interesting, but there is a lot to cover. So I'm not going to spend too long on the introductions. It's my delight, though, to welcome, because the Right Honourable Liam Byrne, MP. We're going to be talking about his book, The Inequality of Wealth. I've got it in my hand, Why It Matters and How to Fix It, which I'm sure you've all obtained already. And of course, we will be then joined in response by George Freeman MP. And the interesting thing about who has been very, very involved, of course, in Radix through the Big Tent organization that he was involved in setting up. So it's all a happy family from that point of view. But it's interesting also, so just looking at the background, they co-chaired Liam and George, the all-party group for inclusive growth. So they have a lot in common. So I do hope there might be some disagreements, nevertheless, coming through, and we've already got quite a lot of questions which we're going to be touching on through the discussion. And also I will invite the odd person to perhaps ask the question personally, which may of course mean opening up your camera. So let's see how we go. So the idea is that Liam will start explaining the background to the book and also what's in it in a few minutes. George will come and say a few words in response, as I said. I will ask some questions and then we'll open it up. So off we go. We've only got an hour. Liam, over to you.
Great, Vicky, thank you very much indeed. And a huge thanks, Ben, to you and the team for Radix for putting this together. And it's a real pleasure to be on the screen together with my friend George Freeman. George and I have been working together on trying to build a cross-party consensus for how you reconnect economic growth and social justice for a lot of the last 10 years, as amongst the many projects that we work on together. So great to be here together today. So this year's an interesting year. So this year is the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith's great book, The Wealth of Nations. And since then, we have been writing books about the wealth of the nation for an awful long time. And the funny thing is that if we went out in the street together today and asked people what the wealth of the nation was, people wouldn't know, I guess, unless you went to an economics department, Vicky, and you'd probably get 10 different answers. Yeah. But basically, the net household wealth of the country is approaching about £13 trillion now. And the remarkable thing is, since I was born in the holy town of Warrington, it's grown 100-fold. But for much of my life, the way that we shared the wealth of the nation was becoming more equal. And something changed quite significantly back in 2010. So since 2010, the wealth of the top 1% has grown by about 31 times more than everybody else. So there's been a real kind of change in the way our political economy works. And that's had all kinds of very bad outcomes. It's had bad outcomes for growth, and it's definitely had bad outcomes for our politics. I have another book that is coming out in March, Why Populists are Winning and How to Beat Them. And if you like, that's the kind of political lens on this economics book, because one of the arguments that I develop is this idea that because people, frankly, are so enraged at how inequitous our country has become, they're reaching for more and more extreme political solutions. First, they reached for Brexit, and now many are turning to populists. So the reason that we should care about wealth inequality is threefold. It has bad political outcomes, not just because people are driven to the extremes, but also because you begin to get quite significant spillovers from the wealthy into politics. So there is a risk that our politics becomes much more corrupt. I haven't seen big money stride through the corridors of power here in Westminster in a way that I see today over the last 21 years. So you definitely see a much more malevolent interest now, much more malevolent influence of big money in politics. And that's true for all countries where wealth inequality is a particular problem. You also then get slower rates of growth. And here the classic economist example is the contrast between, say, the Philippines and South Korea. So back in the 1950s, GDP per capita was pretty similar in both countries. The Philippines was bedeviled by much more serious inequality than Korea was. And over the course of the years that followed, Korea was able to foster a much faster rate of growth than the Philippines because it had more robust and more equitable institutions as a country. But the third peril is that you get social mobility that collapses. And again, you need to look only as far as the Gatsby curves that basically show the relationship between inequality and intergenerational social mobility. Those countries that are characterized by much higher levels of inequality are countries where social mobility begins to collapse. So wealth inequality has grown very significantly over the last 15 years. And we should all care about that because countries that are more unequal are poorer, they are more corrupt, and they're more stagnant. And that is a risk that we have got to kind of escape from in this country. So the way that the book is structured is to kind of take people on a bit of a journey through what life is like for the super rich today. So if you're interested in seeing how a Rolls-Royce Phantom is made or a super yacht is built, or what the Monaco Yacht Show is like, then there's plenty of colour. And there are many of the stories that I come across in my day-to-day work as an MP in Hodge Hill, in particular the work that I was doing with the street homeless community in Birmingham after I lost my dad to what was a lifelong struggle with alcohol about 10 years ago, just to kind of light up the appalling kind of contrast, if you like, between that characterises a country where you have haves, have-nots and have-yachts. The way that I then set about trying to solve the problem is to try and stand back up the word of a work of an economist called James Mead, who was a disciple of Keynes. He invents national income accounting 50, 60 years ago. And Mead did a lot of the heavy lifting on thinking about wealth inequality in the early 1960s. And Mead's argument is that if you want to fix wealth inequality, then you've really got to attend to four things. You've got to raise people's income. Second, you've got to do that because you need to improve the savings rate. And therefore, if you've got a higher savings rate and a higher income, then you've got more people putting more money away. You've then got to try and democratize returns on those savings. And you've got to obviously think about this net of tax. And so what I then use is those kind of four principles to think about a public policy architecture as a kind of a provocation for the future. The first thing you've obviously got to do is you've got to raise the labour rate of income in the national economy. Actually, that's been declining for the last few years. It just began to turn a corner last year. So things I would argue like national minimum wage, like workers' rights, the Employment Rights Act, these are important structural reforms in just helping improve the returns to labour in the economy. And then the core of the argument I make is not the proposals that some advocate, which is universal basic income. I actually say you need something different. You need something called universal basic capital. And the argument here is that you take an idea that Nest has been piloting called jam jar accounts. It's a bit like auto-enrollment pension funds, but it's an auto-enrollment savings account. My argument is that you take that and you universalize it. So you give everybody a savings account when they start work. that would have the spin-off benefit of forcing people to transform the financial literacy education in our schools. And then you pay into that universal savings account, either as cash or perhaps as a savings match, or as a tax break, a one-off dividend to every 25-year-old of about £10,000. And you would put some constraints around that and what you could spend it on. Maybe you could spend it on human capital development. Maybe you could spend it on a deposit for a house. Maybe you could put it towards your pension savings. So you would constrain that. But it would be a big chunk of money, if you like, to a relatively small number of people. Now, where would you get that money from? Well, you would get that money from the creation of a sovereign wealth fund. And you would need to build that sovereign wealth fund up to about 200 billion a year if you were to give every 25-year-old a one-off £10,000 grant or dividend of some sort. Now, of course, we gave away all the proceeds of North Sea oil, unlike the canny Norwegians. If we'd kept those proceeds in a sovereign wealth fund like the Norwegians, we'd have a sovereign wealth fund of about 500 billion. But we didn't do that, so we've got to start again by building that fund up from scratch. And actually, it wouldn't take that long. In fact, you could probably build a fund of about 200 billion in, broadly speaking, 5 years if you put together a lot of state assets which are already lying around in a way that is quite poorly managed, and then adding to that the proceeds of new taxes on wealth. And there's obviously a very wide-ranging debate about how you'd set about doing that. Actually creating a net wealth tax levied on the 22,000 estates of people worth over 10 million is an attractive idea, but is actually very technically difficult to do in practice. But you should probably move towards that by actually beginning to create something like a doomsday book for the super rich, so that we could at least plan some public policy correctly. Jumping straight to a wealth tax, I think, would be incredibly difficult to do. But there are some other things that you can do by basically beginning to equalise, for example, capital gains tax and top rate income, as that hoary old socialist Nigel Lawson did back in the 1980s. And there's a range of other measures that have been proposed by the Wealth Tax Commission that was chaired so ably by Aaron Advani and Andy Summer a couple of years ago. So my point, Vicky, in conclusion, is to say that wealth inequality has been growing. It is a problem. It shouldn't be allowed to persist if we want a more stable politics in the future. And there are a range of public policy solutions which have been tried and tested around the world, which you could connect together and implement here in this country, not as a kind of ad hoc jumble of policies, but as a system which would genuinely change things for the future. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I could comment on a lot of that. I mean, before I invite George, I mean, the one thing to remember is that the US is, of course, a very unequal society, more unequal than all the Western countries put together, and yet they're growing faster. All sorts of other reasons. So we need to just bear that in mind. Unequal both in terms of income and, of course, in terms of wealth as well. So that's one of the issues that perhaps we can debate. And of course, your £10,000 has been suggested by various think tanks before. And so it looks like a very good idea, but as you say, just getting the money is an issue. And then in terms of inequality, certainly you talk in the book quite a lot about both income and wealth. And I can see how you link the two, which I think is really important. So if you can build up your income, you can also build up the wealth and distribute it better. But of course, the Gini coefficient suggests that actually we're not that, we've actually done reasonably well in the last few years.
Yes, I think I would take issue with the Gini coefficient as a way of accurately measuring what is going on, and in particular, there's lots of work that now suggests that the actual wealth of the top 1%, but in particular the top 0.1%, is radically understated, and so some of the metrics that we've got to judge some of the questions at the moment isn't fantastically good.
A very good point. Okay, so thank you very much for that. That was very, very clear. So, George, do you want to respond, or agree, or disagree, or whatever?
Great, thank you, Vicky. Lovely to be here, and thanks for starting the year on a really key topic. And great to be back with Liam. I think we're sort of self-styled, thoughtful radicals in our parties, trying to encourage mainstream parties to be more radical in tackling the big issues of the day. Because if we don't, as Liam has rightly said, the vacuum in the centre will lead to dangerous radical politics of extreme left and right, which is what I think we're seeing. So look, I'm really keen to get into the Q&A, but a few thoughts. I mean, firstly, I'm not in the shadow administration. I'm working cross-party, deputy chair of the Science and Tech Select Committee and UK Trade Envoy. And behind the scenes, encouraging my shadow economic team to think quite deeply about exactly these issues. I think we're at a very serious inflection point, a very broken model of political economy that I'm proud of some of the things that we did in power in the last 14 years. I don't need to go through them now, but it's basically defied mainstream political governments, successive governments, and I fear it's in the process of defying this one as well. And so we have to have this conversation. It's really important. I think this is a very profound breach of the model of political economy that worked post-war, that led to growth, that led to everyone getting better off, and it doesn't work anymore. It's broken. And as a Conservative, I think we need to have a response to that, as well as have a very open debate. A few thoughts. Firstly, I'm really interested in how technology and tech, big tech, is deepening this problem. It's accelerating this problem. Second point, I see it at sort of three levels. Globally, it's a big problem. The global south is getting poorer. As a Conservative, I'm generally a bit less worried about inequality of opportunity and, well, of wealth rather, than the social mobility. So perhaps a big difference between me and someone on the left, possibly me and Liam, is that my nirvana is not really about whether somebody starts in McDonald's. It's whether they can get to run McDonald's. And I think we've got a terrible economy here where social mobility has broken down in the last 30, 40 years quite seriously. So I think we have a real problem, which is the entrenchment of inequality and the fact that it's getting deeper. And I think part of that is global. It's happening at a global level. As trade envoy in the Far East and going to the Gulf, I see extraordinary wealth accumulation. And this country looks increasingly saddled with debt, creaking public services, structural deficits. It's a big problem for us globally. Nationally, I think it's a real problem. And I agree with quite a lot of what Liam has said. I think we need to be thinking much more about, as a former businessman, I think of the balance sheet and the P&L. And governments typically obsess about the P&L. How do we get turn the bottom line from red? That's basically all the Treasury think about. I'd like to think a bit more about the balance sheet, look at the left of the accounts and think, hang on, there's a lot of wealth in this country in all sorts of areas. Let's think about unlocking that wealth in a different way. And I think then we could deal with some of the red flashing lines on the P&L. But you can't cut, borrow or tax your way out of debt. And I think that is a deep problem. It's about the only thing I agree with Liz Truss about. And then thirdly, I think there's a local dimension to this as well. And when setting up Big Tent, as everyone knows, part of my thesis was that in this crisis of political economy and the breakdown of consent and legitimacy for the post-war model of government as we've known it, people are retreating into places they feel safe. And I think a lot of people are prepared to do things for the people and places they love in a way that they're not prepared to do anymore through the tax contract with the state. So I think there's a local dimension to this. How can we tackle it locally? And in my constituency of Norfolk, I've got the poor blue collar, turkey plucking, sausage stuffing, food processing, very low income bit of Norfolk. Everyone says, oh, Norfolk, marvellous. And up in the north of Norfolk on the coast, you've got a very wealthy third home, fourth home, a global elite. So I see it in my own constituency as well. And, that would be sort of, in my world, acceptable if you could see a lot of transfer and a lot of philanthropy and a lot of the wealth in the county in my location helping tackle the social inequality, but you don't. So I think there's a local dimension as well. Third point, I think, so as a Conservative, I'm sort of interested in how thoughtful Conservatives should think about this. I'm going to leave out, there's a whole bunch of sort of short-term politics. I don't think the current government's tax policy is helping. I don't think we've got a cost of living crisis, and I think businesses are, and all that. But that's for the sort of House of Commons. I think the bigger piece, really, and I've written widely about this in the past, I think there's what I've written about as a crisis of disconnection. For me as a Tory, capitalism works when it's connected. So when people can have a stake, a share in the company that they work for. And we've seen a huge reduction in the number of people in this country who have shares in both national wealth, but also in their own company. And that's both at a national level. I mean, people are amazed when I remind them that in 1997, in fact, let's pick a less political date, 2000, the national pension pot, 50 odd percent of it was invested in the UK. That number now is 3.9%. Since I left government, I spent some time in the city, hoping I'd find people who wanting to invest in the UK economy. I basically found we've globalized, digitalized, commoditized, indexized the city. So our national pension pot is not being invested in this country at all. So I actually support the government on the Mansion House reforms. I don't think it's a communist agenda to suggest that we should get to 5% of our national pension pot invested in British companies, or even 10%. So I think there's a sort of crisis of disconnection in our, and that leads to a crisis of capitalism. I think that people, if they can't have a stake in the great machine, they're going to lose faith in it. And that was why I took the Big Tent, third one, I was at fourth, to the Isle of Dogs in the lee of the City of London, when Corbyn was leading the Labour Party, to say, listen, he's successfully tapping into a lot of frustration and anger about the failure of capitalism. Is the response to knock that city over, or is the response to reform the system so that more people around the country can share in the benefits of being able to participate in a vibrant economy? So I think there are some really deep structural issues. And Liam is right that, you know, I think since the crash, QE, we forget sometimes, has played a big part in this. When governments decide to spend about 700 billion propping up the banks, issuing money for the banks to hand out, it's hugely inflationary, but it's hugely wealth dividing, because anyone who owns assets, anyone, including me, and anyone who owns a house or a bit of a house, has made that asset has inflated. Anyone who doesn't has been hugely left behind. So QE has had a major effect in worsening this. So look, a few thoughts on the global side. I'm not sure, if I'm honest, what we do about this, but as a trade envoy, I see it out as trade envoy in Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines. It's pretty clear to me that the UK is suffering from a structural failure of economic statecraft, where our compass is spinning, and we're still not sure whether we sort of basically are a European market economy with, and I think there is an opportunity for us to be a sort of new Norway. I mean, I was a big Remainer, as you all know, but because I didn't think there was a plan for this great reform. But I think there is a model for us to be better connected to sort of Canada, Norway, Switzerland, Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. There are plenty of nations out there that don't want to be in the Beijing bloc, the Moscow bloc, or the Washington bloc, and blockism is becoming very powerful. So I think there's a national, international bit. Nationally, I think we need to think about, Mansion House. I suggested to David Cameron at one point a philanthropy levy. Why don't we say to people, the super rich, hey, listen, in our ideal conservative world, when you're super rich, like Victorians, you endow schools, you endow colleges, you endow hospitals, you endow things. That's what we want you to do.
Can I interrupt you? That was, of course, because there wasn't any state system. There wasn't a public sector. Okay, sure.
I was sort of suggesting the idea, if we don't, basically, if you're too busy or too distracted to want to do it, we'll do it for you, a 10% philanthropy levy. But I think we've got to legitimize wealth and by recycling it. And then I think locally, there's some really important things around, maybe to help the care system and to help the NHS on its knees. I think people are getting bored of putting money nationally and not seeing it come back locally. My mother's just died. My brothers and I are about to inherit her cottage. It's worth 10 times more than it was when she bought it. I'm, in principle, I wouldn't be opposed to sort of 10% of that going into the local care system. If it was local, I'm very opposed to it going into Whitehall to spaff it on something else. But I think we've got to think about local economics as well. So I think there is a really important conversation about reforming what I think is a deeply broken model of political economy. And thank you for hosting this.
No, I agree. And sorry I interrupted you before, but it was a really important point, because you were talking about the possible recycling from the very wealth to contribute to the economy. And first of all, we have a question on that by Ross Savage, who is the Lib Dem MP, but also was going to to intervene, but saying, of course, we do have a state which is now providing the hospitals, supposedly, and all the stuff that perhaps philanthropists did before. So this was really the interjection I want to make, that the system has changed in the Victorian times. So do we still need it? And quite a lot of people think we do. And that was really the point that I wanted to carry on with, if I may. And thanks very much, George, for that. So there was a question along those lines from Ross Savage. Are you here? Is Ross logged on, and can she ask the question about the fact that patriotic millionaires was claimed that they can pay a lot more, either through a wealth tax or other ways?
Ross has dropped out. She's been
dropped
coming
out.
and going, so perhaps has a better explanation. Maybe you could ask her question for her.
Okay, yes. I mean, the question was, it's the obvious way to really go for a wealth tax for the very wealthy, which I think both of you have touched on. So the over 10 million of assets that Liam mentioned is what has been suggested in France, for example. And wealth taxes that have been put in place before haven't quite worked, but they seem to then just concentrate just on property, because there is a flight, and there are lots of questions also in the chat about, are we worried about wealth taxes, that people are simply going to take all the money and leave the country? So Liam, do you want to take that one up? I mean, how difficult is it really to get a wealth tax through?
Yeah. So the Wealth Tax Commission we owe a debt to because it developed the thinking in an important way. Hitherto, wealth taxes have been set at reasonably low levels of wealth and brought into scope quite a large number of people. And so they were very, very difficult to enforce, which is why most OECD countries that embarked on this journey turned back and ended up dropping the idea. What Aaron Avani and Andy Summers and the Wealth Tax Commission propose is, if you like, a smaller number of people in scope, so just 22,000. And that's why they decided to set the kind of target range of this tax at those with estates over 10 million people, over 10 million pounds. So you end up just taxing those who have done extremely well. But because it's quite a small number of people who are extremely wealthy, most of their assets, so goes the argument, would be quite well documented, not least because lots of these things would be insured, and so values would have to be declared, and the compliance burden would be much easier to manage. I think in practice, it would be incredibly difficult to track down all of this wealth, and you then end up with a host of kind of practical questions. So who, for example, is it you tax? Do you tax, how do you basically pin asset ownership to an individual, especially if the wealth is held in a trust, which might be owned by many, many people? You've got your classic questions of, if there are paintings that might be worth a lot of money, what is their current market value? Which is their current market value, the future market value, the value at which they were bought? And then there are questions around timing. So, is it a one-off? Is it every year? If you do it every year, then people are going to start moving assets around. So you basically, you do get quite quickly into a lot of very practical questions about who, what, and when. And these are very difficult questions to solve. And my view, I suppose, is not that this is inherently a bad idea. I think it's got some real logic. My question is, can you really implement it? And not least at a point when we have got no idea where the assets are and who has got what. And it's a great irony, if you like, for a country that invented the Doomsday Book. For those who've ever looked at the Doomsday Book, it is just the most remarkable document. It actually, people forget that it took a long time to put together. So, they did have to go and send out commissioners and swear juries to testify, whose pig belonged to who, and were people hiding sheep in the woods. And it was all then kind of cross-checked again. So it took a long time to put things together all those years ago. And I don't think it would be much quicker this time around. So that's why I think it's an idea with merit. But I do think that its advocates sometimes understate some of the practical implementation challenges, and there's perhaps not quite enough thinking about what would be the critical path of things that you would need to do to actually get this right. And in the meantime, there are other taxes that you could raise on income from capital. And the example that I often use is Rishi Sunak's tax return. So like all prime ministers, Rishi Sunak published his tax return. That was a good thing. But what was absolutely remarkable is that in his last tax return, he declared an income of £2 million and an effective tax rate of 23%. Now, when I show that slide to most people, there are kind of gasps that someone on 2 million can pay 23% tax. But that is, of course, because we don't have the same kind of rates of tax on. We don't charge national insurance contributions on income from investments. The CGT rates are obviously very different, and it's an issue because 60% of income from capital goes to the richest 10% of people. And so, as George said, we've had this huge £700-800 billion subsidy for assets called quantitative easing. That's held interest rates down by about 1 point. Those low interest rates account for about 2/3 of the growth in wealth over the last 10 to 15 years. And yet, overwhelmingly, the owners of that wealth pay a lower rate of tax than others because they take their money in the form of income from investments. So when you put all of that together, it isn't a surprise that wealth inequality has grown so precipitously over the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, and there are, of course, loads of questions in the chat about wealth inequality, inevitably, since this is what we're covering, but also how to tackle it through the tax system.
Vicky, on wealth tax.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just say on wealth tax?
Yeah.
I'm with Liam on this. I think it is a problem it needs solving. But in a global world where wealth is very mobile, I think reaching for the sort of wealth tax club is in danger of just sending the wrong signal. But it's also the wrong question. I think the question for me is, how do we create a political economy in which people with big wealth can recycle it in that economy, in that political economy? How can we create the incentives for that money to be recycled and for them to feel that their citizenship is linked to their contributions? So, for example, on tuition fees, I would argue that we made a big mistake in setting the cap at £9,000. That is not enough for our world-class universities to compete. It's led to them having to take in many, many more foreign students and a lot of problems and risks with that. Why wouldn't we, as a good conservative idea, to say to people, listen, if you come from low-income families, you pay nothing for university, and we're going to fund that through bursaries created by tax relief on UK millionaires creating philanthropies, creating bursaries. So I think we've lacked imagination and wit in finding ways to recycle legitimate wealth into legitimate uses to help tackle this. And I think reaching just for a wealth tax is in danger of sending a message, we don't want wealth here, and people will go.
I think that's a good point. Of course, we've seen some examples of that in the US, which is where it happens quite a bit. So quite a lot of universities are endowed by philanthropists putting the money in and then using those for bursaries. But it's not perfect by any means, and it still is a very unequal place. But yeah, all sorts of ideas like that. But of course, I mean, that's an interesting one. But at the same time, George, you did say, and I think Liam agrees with you, that you could in fact look again at whether capital gains tax is perhaps so too low right now and should be the same as
so on CGT again. I think it needs reforming. I think what the government was trying to do when they talked about working people, they got in a hell of a muddled, clumsy term. But I, as a conservative, basically, I think that we should say to people, if you create wealth, create jobs, create businesses, I would reduce CGT and I'd have CGT taper relief. If you build a company here and you invest and you put mortgage your house and create jobs, we want to encourage that. And when you sell that company, if it's a quick flip, you're going to pay a lot of CGT. If you build it and grow it, you won't pay any. But equally, unearned wealth and wealth that has come through QE is rather different. So I think as conservatives, we need to be thinking about the virtue of wealth creation and being sending a signal about the values that we want to underpin in our economy.
That makes a huge amount of sense. But of course, you've seen that the banks have done rather well, and yet we don't seem to be taxing them as high as perhaps there should be, which of course Nigel Farage has taken as something for him.
Yeah, I mean, a conservative response to the banking crisis would have been, I would argue, that we should have sent some of the directors to prison, made some of the banks go bankrupt, defended the depositors and the savers, and allowed the insurgent and well-run banks to take over. I think it was we've ended up in embodying a lot of crony capitalism and a broken system right at the heart. And it's not the only problem, but it is part of it.
Yeah.
So there we are. But of course, if we go back to to, how do you tax wealth to do all the things that George would like to see happen, and also, of course, Liam as well in his book. And then because we can't do it effectively, and it's going to take a long time or whatever, we focus more on property. I think there is a question that Andrew Dixon has put in the chat about property tax reform as a possible solution to wealth inequality. But maybe, Andrew, you want to ask that question or refine it, and given what has just been discussed?
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, I was just wondering, given the inefficiencies and inequalities of council tax, and also the challenges behind stamp duty in terms of the impact that has on the economy, if property tax reform could be on the agenda, and if so, is it sort of politically palatable?
Liam.
Yes, I mean, it's a really well-made argument, and it's a brilliant campaign that Andrew has helped prosecute. It is an idea that I pick up in the book and argue for too, because you have this kind of inequity at the moment where a house in Blackpool can end up paying more in council tax than a mansion in Mayfair. And so the idea of basically switching on to basically even if it's a flat rate proportional tax on property values would be a much more equitable way to raise money from the property base. And otherwise you end up with what the government is doing at the moment, which is all kinds of messy and lumpy kinds of interventions around different levels and multipliers at different levels. And so it would be much better, I think, just to move to a simple proportion-based system. And that would allow you, I think, not just to raise the same amount of tax as we do together from property today, but to raise more. I would then say, let's recycle some of that surplus into creating the sovereign wealth fund. And let's remember the reason for doing this. I mean, one is that we want to try and create an income stream of dividends to young people to help them get started in life. We are in a country where a quarter of adults have net savings of less than £100. And so if we're serious about rekindling what was once a cross-party consensus to rebuild the property-owning democracy, or the wealth-owning democracy, as I would call it, then we are going to need some bold policy interventions. And property tax just feels to me like one of the key components of getting that right.
Yeah. Well, could I then, since we're talking about this and savings in particular, which I think is an interesting one, Ewan Grant, you're here. Perhaps you'd like to ask that question, because you want to rebuild savings, is what we were talking about just a few seconds ago. I think, Liam, you made that very clear in the book as well, and in what you said in your summary. And yet we've just got the Labour government increasing the tax on savings. So, Ian, do you want to ask your question, really, in terms of how do you perhaps tax different types of wealth and our savings wealth? Is that, I think, what you wanted to say? Ewan, are you there? No? Okay, well, I've asked that question about savings. Liam, do you want to perhaps touch on that? Thank you.
Sure. So what Mead reminds us is that those who do very well in life tend to enjoy a higher rate of return than those who are poor. And the IMF has been looking at this a bit over the last few years. And one of the papers that I cite is a study from Norway, where people do have to publish their tax returns. And what is remarkable about that is that you can see how those who are really quite well off can enjoy average returns of up to 18% a year. And yet, of course, if you have nothing, then you're in the hands of loan sharks. And so you've got negative rates of return on your assets. And so how do you democratize access to higher levels of return? Well, one of the ways you do that is by socializing that access. And that's why the idea of sovereign wealth fund, I think, is so attractive. This is something that has been created by 44 countries around the world now. Average rates of return between 7 or 8% a year. It would be quite, at that kind of level of return, you would begin to build up your sovereign wealth fund really quite quickly. And then recycling those returns and democratizing the dividends to young people just seems, mechanically like something that would be perfectly possible. You do then have to align the tax rates on savings. And you probably have to do something a little bit bolder on inheritance as well. Inheritance tax, of course, is one of the most unpopular taxes that you can begin to get into. And so there may be virtue in exploring a gift tax. So you basically transfer the burden of tax to the person who receives the money. And Vicky, the reason that this is so important is, of course, the longer I've been in politics, the more I realise that things can always get worse. And wealth inequality is set to get radically worse unless something changes, because nothing lasts forever, including the baby boomers. And as the baby boomers shuffle off this mortal coil, they're going to transfer about £5.5 trillion to the next generation. And of course, some will inherit fortunes, but others will inherit care bills. And so the kind of cascade of wealth inequality is about to get much, much more pronounced. And so unless you begin thinking about taxing savings in a more progressive way, and potentially a smarter intervention around potentially gift taxes too, then things are going to get much worse than they are today. And you will get the development, as Robert Putnam has written about some parts of America, which are effectively becoming a caste society now, where you do have a return almost to a Victorian era where groups in our society just never meet, they just never cross. They might live on the same island, but they never come across each other because they live in such different worlds. And that I fear is where we're heading unless we begin to change course now.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, George may want to come in, but I just thought I'd take in, because before I couldn't see who was, whether Ros was still here, but Sean Turnbull, you put your hand up. So I wonder if, because it's all linked to what we've just been discussing, do you want to come in? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to suggest a counterintuitive idea of giving tax deductions to the rich on condition they change corporate constitutions so they transfer their equity by internal book entries to the stakeholders living in their region and their community who elect the politicians to give the tax deduction. It'll be a self-financing tax deduction because you're getting people off welfare and you're getting new taxes from spreading the asset income producing assets. You're spreading those locally and you're getting them back into the local communities to create a circular economies. So I don't agree with sovereign wealth funds. I don't agree with taxing. I agree with an incentive. And my authority for doing that, as an entrepreneur, I've twice set up new ventures. I've raised millions of dollars from hundreds of people on 15-year leases. So they are competing with all the other investment opportunities, and rich people are willing to go into limited life equities. And as soon as you've got limited life equities, the extended life can then be shared with the stakeholders. So it's win-win for the Conservative Party and it's win-win for the Labour Party. You get both sides of politics voting for it like they do for employee share plans, which are not self-funding and only involve those who have work rather than the stakeholders. So what do you...
Thank you. Perhaps George can come in first with that.
I mean, very quickly, if anyone's not familiar with Sean's work, it's worth reading. He's a great creative thinker, has been on this for a long time with some, so I like where he's coming from. I just make one quick point, which is one of the manifestations of wealth inequality in our system is in public services. So the traditional model post-war is you pay your tax and then benign governments make sure that it's well spent and give you really good public services. It's not working. It's broken. A whole bunch of reasons. Too much money absorbed in the bureaucracy, too little hitting the ground, austerity, a whole bunch of things, right? But I observe in my part of the world that there's a lot of people with a lot of money who've retired who'd like to put something back. But I don't. We're terrible in this country, I think, at the moment of making that easy. And one of the ideas in the past is public sector enterprise. I don't mean privatization, right? What I mean is, let's take, say, the Norfolk reoffending service. It, like all public services, is on its knees. It's failing. It's costing a lot of money. Imagine if the government said, hey, here's a local deal. This is what this is costing us over the next 10 years. And this is the outcome it's delivering. If a group of you, employees, could form a not-for-profit social enterprise to run it better, you could keep half the saving and put it back into the system. Treasury would keep the other half, and you could unlock some real local leadership. And I think if we don't embrace some quite bold incentive-based models, as Sean has highlighted, they need to be localized, because people are not going to give up their lives to work for the big broken state, but they would get involved in their locality. And I think we're not connecting enough with people's love of place.
Which is actually beginning to happen in sort of in the energy network, where local communities can take, which is beginning to happen. I think that would be very good. Liam, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting line of thought. So, one of the things that I drove through with some difficulty back in 2009 as Chief Secretary was social impact bonds, and we issued the first social impact bonds in the criminal justice system around Peterborough Prison. And since then, the market for social impact bonds has grown. They're not a silver bullet. They may be part of a solution design. And if a simple way to illustrate this is if you take my area of East Birmingham. East Birmingham is one of the poorest parts of the country. It is bedeviled by some of the biggest public service failures in the country. There isn't the capital to mobilise in East Birmingham to invest in solving the problems of East Birmingham. There are definitely social enterprises that can make a big difference, but at the end of the day, you do need, in my view, state-based redistribution mechanisms for things to actually happen. And so, this is where George and I would kind of differ in the sense that I think George would probably rely more on market-based solutions than I would, and he would rely less probably on state-based solutions than I would. That's probably the difference between us. But my kind of counsel, I suppose, would be you've got, there are slightly big inequalities between areas that some areas would never be able to mobilise the kind of capital that was needed to solve their problems locally. And equally, you have got to be slightly careful that you end up relying on charity rather than a guarantee. And charity can be a gamble, not a guarantee of a state service. And that was a big argument for the Labour Party in the 1920s and 1930s, when of course most of the health services were funded through charitable donations rather than through tax resource. You end up with solutions which are quite patchy. You end up with sustainability problems, and you end up with social rights that are frankly just a little bit kind of flawed and less easy to rely on.
I get that, and to be clear, I'm really not advocating a return to pure philanthropy.
No, I know. Yeah.
But I think in a world where the tax burden is becoming so high that it's driving people out of the country, giving them tax breaks for reinvesting in their own community, I think could be quite attractive. And there's a policy area, Vicky, where this is very hot, right? Railways. I think both parties have failed terribly on railways. I used to be Minister of State at the Department of Transport. I think the Tory privatisation was botched and wasn't got right in the late 80s, early 90s. And I really fear this nationalisation isn't going to work either. I floated an idea, which is regional railway companies. So in East Anglia, I'd love to have an East Anglian railway company that owns the track and the train operating company, is run as a company. We're playing one club golf in this country. We tend to think public or private, very aggressive global quoted or private equity capital private or big state. There's a whole bunch of company models in the middle. I'd love an East Anglia Railway Company. Anyone with a season ticket is an automatic shareholder. Profits are recycled back into the system. By the way, it would have the right to develop housing along the 52 stations that have got plants growing through the roof. We could create on the balance sheet of this country a FTSE 200 company. It's actually owned by the citizens of East Anglia. And I think quite a lot of our very rich East Anglian citizens would say, I'd quite like to run that. So I think we're not being bold enough about how you reallocate assets to create opportunity and income.
I think that's absolutely fair. And of course, if you look at trying to do that centrally, given that the cost of basically levelling up has now increased, if anything, given everything that's happened over the last few years, then that's a very good idea. And we're getting towards the end, not quite there, but Robert Shaw had quite long on entrepreneurship, because obviously we're talking about encouraging people to invest and get some returns on them. So Robert, do you want to ask your well, it's slightly condensed version of your question that you had pre-submitted?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, if I can just break ranks, I want to say what an optimistic and thoughtful conversation this is, and it represents for me as someone just as a general taxpayer, the best of Parliament, and I wish we could see more of this on in our papers and in our journals. So thank you, Liam and George for what you're saying and the way you're engaging in this debate. I'm really just asking a very brief question, which is how do you maximize employment? If employment is the base level of wealth creation, what can we do to encourage employers to employ more people, to give them better jobs? And perhaps I'm focusing too locally on the recent budget, but I think taxes like employers' national insurance don't seem to be encouraging wealth creation through the very base level entry of giving people access to excellent jobs.
Good point. Well, Liam,
well,
I mean, we're not saying you're responsible for the policies that have just come out.
And the Business and Trade Committee has been sort of reasonably robust about its views on some of this stuff. And we'll have more to say when we publish our report on small business, which will be coming out quite soon. Small business employs most of the country. And at the moment, there's a real barrage of challenges that our small businesses are having to navigate, from rising energy costs through to business rates and employment costs. And the point is that if employment costs are going to go up because the government is trying to rebalance the labour share of national income, then other costs do need to come down if you're to improve the return on investment. And the costs that need to come down first are energy costs. But what business after business tells us is that the regulatory costs, and in particular the incoherence of regulation, is something that is really holding back growth. So there's more that we will say on this, and you'll be pleased to hear, Robert, that the committee has also decided that at some point this year we'll be launching an inquiry into enterprise and enterprise support as well, because that's something that we all feel quite passionate about too. So we'll have more to say on this over the course of the next year.
Thank you.
Okay, great. George, do you want to?
Well, very quickly, I mean, yeah, I agree that basically, for the best of intentions, if you tax companies employing people, they will employ people less. And certainly in my part of the world, we're seeing a tidal wave of youth unemployment. A lot of small companies, I used to run one. If you make it expensive, difficult, costly, and legally challenging to hire, they'll hire less, and that is a real problem. But I also think we need to be thinking more about how we have wider share ownership. I mean, as a conservative, I would like to see, I think, some basic national minimum wage. We were wrong back in the 80s to say it would be the end of capitalism as we know it. But I do think flexible working and some 0 hours contracts suit some particular people. And I think we've got a huge problem with people not having a share in their company. I used to be a director of a company in which 120 staff, everyone had shares, and the AGM, the forklift driver would come in and we'd all, go through the business. And it was not a socialist company. It was a well-run British business. And I just think my party also has forgotten to make the case for wider share ownership and to incentivize it through the tax system.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, we were nearing the end, but there have been some seriously deep questions about, how do you define, can you actually, I think we had a question, think that taxing wealth or reducing tax inequality that came from Isabel Bourassa is compatible with capitalism? Now, we're not going to go into that. That's a very, very deep question that we need to really think about. And we've also had a question that said, how do you define money? I mean, we just discussed QE and what it all meant. So what is the ontology of money? That came from Ivor Middleton. Again, that would take a great question, but it probably not, unless you think you can answer it in
I'm going to give you a 30-second.
30 seconds, that would be great.
I got back from a visit to Hong Kong before Christmas, and I was blown away by how China is now using Hong Kong as the sort of race against Singapore. It's the annex, or the innovation annex for the Chinese economic model. And they've clearly identified that American dominance, the pillars of American dominance, one of them was Bretton Woods and then the petrodollar. And China is clearly backing crypto and blockchain as a new economic model that is dominated by China. And I think there's a whole thing. Liam's done some brilliant work on AI and the hollowing out of the employment market and what that means. I think there's a huge currency issue globally, which is going to exacerbate these inequalities.
Right, indeed. Well, again, quite a lot of questions on inequality have come up. Robin Stafford as well had been asking about, again, the sort of wealth issues and taxation. So there's one. Belinda Phipps had been asking about how you overcome some of the obstacles of this, to getting to greater equality. Things that I think have been touched already in the answers. So I'm not going to go into them in more detail, but they were very useful in shaping the questions that we've all been discussing today. There is one final one, if I could, which I think has more to do with demographics. So because things are changing, how are we going to cope with the way in which the population is aging, and we actually need to spend an awful lot more money on keeping people, and is that compatible with well, or perhaps it accelerates the need to look at this. I'm trying to see who had asked that question about. So forgive me a second.
Forgive me, Vicky. I've got to go at 2 for a call at 2.
All right. Well, in that case, that question, we're just not going to answer it now, but I think it's one that we need to take into account for the future. So thank you very much for submitting it. So I think we're practically there. And I think I'll turn to Ben to summarize and close it. And thank you very much to the Radix team for putting this all together. And thank you also for Liam and George for contributing so well to this. So over to you, Ben.
So the first thing I'm going to say is I'm not going to attempt to summarize that. You've given me less than a minute, so that would be impossible. But it was a clearly very, very stimulating discussion. And Katrina, thanks for your comment. Could we have a part 2? I will pick up with Liam and George, and we'll see if there is a sort of way to approach this that doesn't end up repeating some of the same points, because I would like to continue discussion. Can I say, if you wanted to respond to some of the comments and you haven't had the opportunity, you can always submit a blog to Radix Big Tent. We normally look for 400 to 600 words. We don't guarantee we will publish them, but if you've got something interesting to say, we would be delighted to see it. If you want to give us a couple of bullet points before you spend your time writing something long, I can tell you if it's something that would interest us. Thirdly, I want to say, I love the idea of a philanthropy levy, George, and we are, of course, a very poor charity. If you've enjoyed the discussion today, I can see lots of people who are significantly better off online than Radix Big Tent. But the good news is you can choose to be taxing philanthropists by using the donate button on our website that my colleague Sophie has just put in the chat, and we would very much appreciate your support. We put these events on, and they do seem to make a difference. So look, thank you so much for your time. Do stay in touch with. Thank you, George, Liam and Vicky, for a great discussion, and I look forward to seeing you too. Oh, one last question that was in the chat was whether we will put this online. Yes, give us 48 hours just to turn it around on video, and then you can check it out and circulate it to all of your friends.
And remind everyone, there is another one. The next one is on the 5th of February.
Oh, 5th of February, yes. Join us 5th of February with Vince Cable, who will be discussing his book on China. So that should be excellent. Take care.